Ambassador Waschuk, great to have you here. Pity you are leaving. You've been here as an ambassador of Canada to Ukraine for 5 years. This is the closest allies today, I would say. Canada is the closest ally for Ukraine today, and both you are from Ukrainian origin, and the current foreign minister, Chrystia Freeland, as well, as nobody knows, out of other foreign ministers, knows our country. But you arrived here in October 2014.
Yeah.
So to which country you arrived and which country you are leaving?
Okay, I think Ukraine was definitely a crisis and conflict affected country in October of 2014. Hyperinflation, threat of large-scale invasion, major losses at the front. We were still a few months away from Debaltsevo, which was the last very big battle of that period. So we were really on the brink. And a lot of our time was as ambassadors and was spent talking to senior Ukrainian officials about how to not fall over the edge, both in security terms, but also in economic terms. And we are now far away from the brink, except maybe in some very vivid media or Facebook portrayals. But we're in a situation where I think we were in sort of a 12% economic decline free fall. And bear in mind that in most of our countries, a 0.3% decline is already cause for great concern. This is 12%. And we're now arguing over whether 3.5 or 4 or 5 is good enough as growth. The Russian market was cut off. A lot of Ukrainian producers were in crisis. Now Ukraine is the largest supplier of grains to a country like China. In fact, Ukraine, I think, now exports twice as much grain as Canada. So a lot has happened in these 5 years on the constructive side. The Ukrainian army is probably the most battle-experienced conventional force in Europe today. We have 200 Canadian troops who are acting as trainers and advisors, and they have managed to pass along a lot of both information and skills, but they've also learned a lot from their Ukrainian counterparts.
At the same time, the elections which had taken place this year had shown that there is a dissatisfaction of the society due to the slow reforms, due to the slow economic growth, which really showed like low trust to the previous government.
Yeah.
Now it's very different. However, still, when you read the foreign press, of course, you talking about the Ukrainian oligarchy, you're talking about the reforms which hadn't happened, and particularly in the juridical part and these other things. So to what extent, how would you also still describe this part of the reform success and not success? The part of the unsuccess was there due to the fact of the dissatisfaction of the people.
That's assuming the people are always right when it comes to assessing every degree of progress. I'm maybe a bit biased as a lifelong government official, but change in government takes time, unfortunately. And when you try to do it immediately, you often have side effects that were not foreseen. It is a commonly held view here that, for example, judicial reform was slow and inadequate. At the highest level, Supreme Court, it was actually, by global standards, very quick. Imperfect, but in the space of, 2.5 years, you completely fired the old Supreme Court and hired a new one, which is now being reformed as we speak. What maybe should have happened, or could have also been approached is reforming things at the level where the ordinary citizen or the ordinary business person first encounters the courts, which is at local level. If you start from the top, it takes a long time for change to filter down. So I think there's the current wave of reform should focus a lot on what worked at the initial phase of police reform, which is attacking the citizen-facing level, the one that people encounter when they go and try to lodge a case, and which basically determines whether they feel good or bad about a system.
So what are your major, aspects for the concern and for the hope?
Right. Hope is Ukrainian small and medium business, which is dynamic and which needs to be encouraged to find its place in the legitimate taxation system of the country. It is in civil society, but I think it has to watch out to not become donor dependent. Civil society needs to reconnect with Ukrainian society, especially in the regions, and to be primarily materially dependent on it and not on people like me and embassies like ours. Dangers are, come back to the oligarchy, excessive political control by individual oligarchs, which then largely could undermine the positive messages that the new cabinet of ministers has been sending. I think the government program that's been outlined is probably the most ambitious ever in Ukraine. A lot of the people in the cabinet of ministers and the prime minister himself, Waschuk, are people that we know and have successfully worked with for years, and they're people who evoke positive feelings and desire to invest on the part of foreign business. It's important not to have contrary messages being sent by influential big private players in Ukraine.
Still, I would ask about the oligarchy. How is it transforming itself? Is it transforming? As anyway, many foreign journalists now coming and asking, like, so how about Ukrainian oligarchy? And how would you describe it compared to the, I don't know, some years ago?
Gosh. I think Ukrainian big business is not going to go away. The question is how you tame it, how you create equal set of rules, a level playing field for everybody. So I think the idea of de-oligarchization, as it was often discussed, has turned out to be a bit of an illusion. So you need a situation where, we come back to rule of law again, where everybody will be treated fairly. That, I think, will build confidence internally and build confidence externally.
So what do you mean the illusion, because some say like, oh, is it like the lost case? I would clarify. Do you mean that they just own too much of the things in the country already, and that you can't really, take away the things which the big businessmen already have, because that would be a risk for private property? So do you think really how to deal with that? Because like any discussion about that they won't own something could also spark the question on the private property.
That's right. And to be perfectly honest, many of their companies are structured in a way that they are protected from expropriation by offshore ownership in Western jurisdictions. So you then run up against private property protections in Western countries as well. So clearly, if this were a super simple subject that one interview answer could fix, it would have done a long time ago. It hasn't. It's complex. And it needs finessing and determination on the part of a government. But I think, again, we see, what we're hearing now, for example, from the president, from presidential and government spokespeople is there will be no return of Privatbank to the previous owners, because that they have looked at the situation in terms of Ukrainian law, and it cannot be done, and they are welcoming and aggressively pursuing the legal case to return money to Ukrainian taxpayers being pursued at the High Court in London. So that sort of approach, which is a rule of law based approach, which is a kind of forward-leaning approach, is one that will be welcomed.
You mentioned you worked with many people in the government, because they've been among the reformers, worked in different organizations, also in the government, like Ministry of Defense Hromadske and the others. Yet, still the president is a definitely outsider, is from a different sphere. And as an ambassador who's been here for a while, when you heard how also your views or interaction has changed in the time you learned that there would be the famous comedian running for the presidency, which was probably shocking, especially for the people in the West, to what we are now?
Well, maybe a bit less shocking for me. A, I like comedy, and B, I think you can't write and perform in a TV series like Sluha Narodu without understanding the mechanics of the Ukrainian political process and of Ukrainian society. So satire is a form of understanding. I think where the president and his team clearly have started to work and need to continue working is how do you go from understanding, depicting, to influencing and changing.
On what issues you like, for instance, you were discussing with the president, like as an ambassador?
We discussed the approach to, like say, in the G8 context, the G7 context, to economic reform. There he said, I've got a certain idea. I've been a small and medium business person myself, but I've got Mr. Waschuk here, who's an expert, and he can give you the detail. Similarly, on foreign security and defense policy, we had President Zelensky at the Toronto Ukraine Reform Conference, beginning of July. He went over very well with our North American audience because he comes across as sincere, he comes across as a listener, he comes across as someone who is not just using standard politician talking points, but willing to think outside the box, but also to look at individual cases, look at people's needs, and develop solutions.
Were you at the meeting? There was a meeting of the G7 ambassadors with the head of the president's office, Bogdan.
Yes.
Yeah. So, what were discussing? How was that meeting? We know that the proximity of Mr. Bogdan to Hromadske always raises the questions. Was this issue as well addressed?
We actually had, I think we've had 2 meetings, and I think certainly at the second of the 2 meetings there was Mr. Bogdan took the initiative in clarifying himself the distinction between the government position on Privatbank and any position that might be expressed by Mr. Kolomoisky. So certainly we've been hearing clear differentiation between those 2 spheres.
After the diplomatic scandal with the US, how does it influence the Ukrainian relations with other partners? I think it's hard to say that, like, if the US is out, things are just the same. We don't have now the ambassador here, neither the acting ambassador nor the previous. We don't know when to wait for the ambassador, but the US had been a player.
Yeah. And I think you should also have an ambassador in Washington. That would be good too. I would say it's even more important for Ukraine to be well represented by people who are able to proactively, constructively, positively convey the Ukrainian message in New York, Washington, as is being done in a place like, for example, Berlin. I think your ambassador in Berlin is very effective in reaching the very diverse, regionally diverse German media. Ambassador Shevchenko in Canada has been a very good and proactive spokesperson as well for Ukraine. That's important for a country that's looking to get more control over the narrative. Returning to your previous question, though, of does it make a difference if when and how the U.S. engages? Of course it does. Can a factor like that be replaced by any other country or set of countries? Challenging. But I think we do understand that we are going through a moment where especially those countries that have a commitment to a rules-based international order, to multilateralism, need to be more active, need to work together, need to be more cohesive. So there's the Alliance of Multilateralists, of which Canada is a member. That includes France, includes Germany, includes Japan, countries like that. And we are coordinating more than ever. And we are trying to ensure that the interests of especially middle powers, and that includes Ukraine, are respected.
So the Canadian current government, the government had won the elections with different results. However, it's more or less the same leadership. What Ukrainians can expect from Canada regarding our relations, and in particular the Canadian, what could be, you think, and you would like, the Canadian role would be in this very volatile international environment where now I just want to nail it down that US isn't there, we know the issues in the UK, we know that in Germany Angela Merkel may leave, and she announced that it's just a matter of time. France is now engaged so much in the Middle East, so you really see that that's not a very favoring environment. So what Canada, the country Ukrainians trust, can do?
I think partly it is to continue with the commitments we've already made, and that is both our military and our police missions are extended to 2022. So you can count on that as programs in the bank, so to speak. We'll be launching some new projects at inclusive economic development, especially targeting Ukraine south and east in the coming months. And we will be as active, if not more, internationally in supporting a positive case for Ukraine. But for that, Ukraine has to be able to articulate the positive case for itself. It's hard to be positive about a country where people are beating themselves around the head all the time about how we're not good enough for this, or everybody else except me in this country is terrible at that. Again, you're not going to have perfect consensus. No country does. But you need to have a positive external consensus of most political forces that allow friends to work with something. I'm hoping your parliament has created a commission to think about what a solution for eastern Ukraine might look like, but a capital U Ukrainian solution. And I'm hoping that can be something that's realistic, and that's something that friends and partners of Ukraine can get behind.